Привіт, це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Моє ім'я Наталка Гуменюка, зі мною тут
Ангеліна Корякіна, привіт! І ми продовжуємо наш другий сезон. Сьогодні ми будемо говорити з черговим неймовірно цікавим гостем Наталки і людиною, яку складно окреслити спеціалістом лише з якоїсь однієї справи або одного напрямку, тому що це журналіст надзвичайно широкого профілю, людина, яка працювала у великій кількості частин світу, Джон Лі Андерсон. Наталка, розкажи, будь ласка, як ти вирішила поговорити з Джоном і про що саме ви з ним говорили, тому що він працював і в Латинській Америці, і на Близькому Сході, і писав неймовірно цікаві профайли великих історичних постатей. Про що ви говорили?
Я, правда, вважаю, що якщо треба назвати журналіста номер один в світі, який за останні 50 років висвітлював головні події, говорив з ключовими лідерами, то це, певно, Джон Лі Андерсон. Він є журналістом, автором видання The New Yorker, який робить такі величезні, довгі, класичні статті. Це така ікона для журналістики, але дуже багато часу він працював саме в Латинській Америці, щоб розуміли. Це людина, яка там свого часу робила профайл Піночета, Фіделя Кастро, зустрічалася там з Габріель Гарсія Маркесом. Він почав свою кар'єру там наприкінці 70-х, з 90-х, 2000-х і останні 3 декади. Всі якісь ключові трагічні події, чи це війна в Сирії, чи Афганістан, він висвітлював. Ми з ним познайомилися дійсно я б сказала, за таких символічних так само обставин. А я довго чекала на цю розмову, тому що він важлива людина для нашої організації. Мені здається, що я згадувала в деяких інших наших подкастах, як народився наш проект «Поєднуючи континенти». Така іскорка, яка подарувала цю ідею, була стаття в виданні New Yorker, профайл на той час нового президента Чилі, 2022 рік, Боріча, який, хоча він лівий, казав, що він підтримав Україну, як би там його не схиляли на свій бік Росія і Китай. Він сказав, що він саме той лівий, який є прихильником демократичної традиції Сальвадора Альєнде, а не Кастро, і він таким залишається. І він згадав тоді, що він бере в свою відпустку, президент Чилі, книжки Тімоті Снайдера, ще одного героя наших подкастів, співрозмовника, щоби краще зрозуміти Східну Європу. І ось тоді народилася думка, що є люди на континенті, які хочуть просто зрозуміти. І, можливо, там не президентів, а їх треба привозити. І ми почали привозити до України саме людей з усього світу. І потім навіть там народилася, коли була можливість, я їхала до Чилі, ми передавали якось через певних людей книжки Борічу, підписані Тімоті Снайдером. Автором цієї статті був Джон Лі Андерсон, але я в той час на це не звернула увагу. І тут торік, коли була конференція ЗЕК в Грузії, Наталя Антилава, я сподіваюся, теж відома грузинська журналістка, яка там багато про що пише, вона редакторка міжнародного видання «Кода», Наталя сказала: «Наталко, а ти приїдеш до нас в Тбілісі? Я хочу зробити історію про твій проект, про континенти. Я запрошу для тебе модератором Джон Лі Андерсона». І я подумала, нічого собі. Кажу: «Наталю, ти навіть не уявляєш, який це цікавий збіг, що така людина», я якось тоді не зрозуміла, що це був Джон Лі Андерсон, я не пов'язувала цю статтю, саме конкретно цю статтю з ним, я якось зв'язала всі речі і кажу, це просто символічно чудово. І ми мали ось цю розмову в Тбілісі тоді, і я можу просто сказати, напевно, після всього цього ми мали кілька дискусій разом. Це один з найдобріших, якихось найпрекрасніших людей, журналістів, відкритіших, яких я коли-небудь зустрічала. Він настільки цікавий до всього, співчутливий, стільки всього знає, готовий допомогти, комунікує. Як тільки я йому розказала історію про Боріча, він написав Борічу. Якийсь він такий дуже простий, легкий, і я дуже хотіла з ним говорити про Латинську Америку, про все, якось просто не було ніколи часу, відкладала цей подкаст, бо знала, що треба багато часу. І от коли ми почали домовлятися, це вже був грудень, і він був в планах, в день, коли я планувала все, писала, ще про дещо запитувала. Я розуміла, що впав режим Асада, і питаю: «Джон Лі, напевно, ти їдеш до Сирії?» Він каже: так, я саме в дорозі в Дамаск. Зараз він, власне, написав кілька матеріалів. Його один з матеріалів про цю в'язницю у Сирії, про те, що там відбувається. Тому спочатку наша розмова була про Сирію, про те, що він там побачив, про вплив Росії. Але загалом потім я не могла уникнути великої кількості питань, бо я хотіла попросити Джона Лі пояснити українцям Латинську Америку, лідерів, яких він зустрічав, бо там цікаво з ним говорити, тому що ось отут я говорив з Лулою, тут я говорив з Борічем, отут я говорив з Мілеєм. Це президенти Бразилії, Чилі і Аргентини відповідно. І в нього, тобто, рівень якогось доступу, розуміння, звісно, це не просто експерт, це людина, яка говорить з першими особами. Я запитувала, про латиноамериканських лівих, про їхні зв'язки з Радянським Союзом, з Росією, що може робити Україна. Одна з його останніх історій перед Сирією, це був великий профайл Мілея, президента Аргентини, який лібертаріанець, який теж незвичний, скажімо так, персонаж, але в той же час підтримує Україну і має певні відносини з Володимиром Зеленським. Питань якось, чесно скажучи, багатенько. В Україні він був двічі. Я, звісно, запитала і про його відчуття і враження України, і
мені здається, ми
охопили світ.
Це людина, яка висвітлювала не один світовий конфлікт. Цікаво, наскільки йому цікава Україна. Ти кажеш, він тут був. Я так розумію, він не пише, спеціально не цікавиться, це не його тема, яку він давно веде, Україна, але що йому цікаво, що він знає, наскільки він близький до теми війни Росії в Україні.
Джон Лі Андерсон – великий гуманіст, людина та голос, який говорить про репресії, говорить про зло, говорить про демократії. Тому для нього Україна – це та країна, яка бореться з великим злом, де люди намагаються врятуватися, не просто врятуватися, а захистити свої цінності. Коли він тут був, він зустрічався з президентом України Зеленським, він зустрічався з великою кількістю людей. Тобто йому важливі речі. Він, наприклад, можу сказати, оскільки він буває на більшості заходів, таких важливих журналістських, медійних конференціях, літературних в Латинській Америці. Він там був знайомий з Вікою Амеліною, коли вона була там, колись писав профайл її після, на жаль, її загибелі. Тобто це ось той гуманіст в світі і журналіст, який не омине великої історії і великого конфлікту, якихось страждань людей, щоб про них написати. І, очевидно, наша війна, на жаль, так само є такою ж важливою, як і багато інших речей, тому йому болить. Він постійно говорить, ви почуєте в цій розмові, як багато він говорить про причини, зокрема, чому, можливо, бракує солідарності на певних регіонах, в певних континентах, якою є проблема з тим, що робили Сполучені Штати, що зробила Росія, говорить про те, як, скажімо так, цьому протистояти на рівні людському. Його цікавить цілий світ, і він, людина ціннісна насамперед, тому все наше йому так само не байдуже. Але я наголошу ще одну річ. От є просто люди, яким цікаві люди, цікаві країни, цікаві люди, з якими він говорить. І тому, Україною складно не зацікавитися, коли ти сюди приїздиш, але я можу просто наголосити на оцій речі, яку я інколи згадую щодо певних наших спікерів, яких мені пощастило зустріти особисто. Це вражає, коли люди такого рівня, з таким досвідом залишаються такими простими, помічними, легкими в комунікації, відвертими. І знаєш, коли він з тобою говорить на конференції, таке враження, що, напевно, він не говорить з тобою в іншому тоні, а ти не президент. Він до тебе звертається приблизно з якимось рівнем поваги, зацікавленості, навіть якщо ти український журналіст, а не президент Бразилії чи Фідель Кастро, умовно кажучи.
Велика вдача послухати твою розмову з Джоном Лі Андерсоном в нашому подкасті, коли все має значення. І користуйтеся цією вдачею. Розмова Наталки Гуменюк з журналістом Джоном Лі Андерсоном.
Fascinating I have the chance to talk to you, and there are so many questions I have. But obviously, Jon Lee, the first would be, you've returned from Syria. You reported the region before. You published these fascinating articles about the search for the loved ones in the Syrian prison and what will happen to Syria later. But what was for you the thing you mentioned, like something you just saw, you went there and saw, like, I didn't expect to see, or I expected to see?
Yeah, here's the thing. And I knew Syria from the beginning of the war. I hadn't been back in 10 years, but I knew that the system was cruel. I knew a lot of people had died, but somehow Syria had become a kind of white noise. I think it was that way for a lot of people. And although you can understand some things in this world intellectually or virtually because you've seen them on the news or you've seen something on social media or whatever, arguably you know these things, but you don't feel them anymore. But I felt a compulsion to go back when I heard Assad had fled because I knew it's like a tectonic plate shifting in the world. This was the last of the Ba'athist regimes. This was the last of the Arab nationalist political tyrannies that pretty much dominated North Africa and the Middle East since the end of the war, World War II, from the time of decolonization until now. This was the last one. This was a Soviet clone in a Middle Eastern clothing. This was an out-and-out dynastic dictatorship. The fact that it was collapsing after so many years following what we know, the destruction of Hezbollah by Israel, the weakening of Iran, which was using Syria as a cat's paw against Israel, all these things meant that this not only was a father-son dynasty ending after 60 years, but Middle Eastern world's one-time most stable linchpin was now collapsing. And the Middle East was going to change. The tectonic plates are actually shifting as we speak, but we don't know quite where they're going to end up. So this is a major moment. And I wanted to see it for myself because I've seen a number of regime changes. I've seen the end of the first Taliban. I saw the return of the Taliban and the end of the American cycle. I saw the end of Gaddafi. I saw at the beginning of the militias there. I saw the American invasion of Iraq and so on in the aftermath. This moment was key. Now, having said all of that, what I didn't expect was the degree of institutionalized sadism that I found, the degree of medieval levels of cruelty that had been institutionalized in the tortured dungeons of Assad's Syria was still shocking and deeply saddening to see the way they had treated men and women, locking them always underground in windowless cells for years on end, in places that were far too small for humankind, intentionally packing them in like sardines in places. The torture instruments one saw, from cutting tools to whips to blindfolds to, just sickening stuff. And knowing that so many of the people had simply been killed. I mean, the first days, and I saw hundreds of families wherever I went looking for their loved ones. And this was the degree that the citizenry of Syria was disenfranchised from their regime. They believed that the government was so evil that they very possibly had let their loved ones suffocate in an underground prison and seal its entrance, which they then spent the next week looking for. Of course, I sensed immediately that it was a mythical prison underground, that this was just something they had constructed and gossip had created so that they could believe that their loved ones were still alive. They couldn't quite believe that they were dead. They believed that the regime had actually locked them away so that they would suffocate to death as a final act of spite before leaving. That's how dark they believed their regime was. And then the more I went around, the more I found these sort of small prisons run by various intelligence agencies in residential neighborhoods. In some cases, they had taken over apartment blocks next to other apartment blocks. And I mean, small 5-story apartments, very close quarters. And for years, people lived alongside these things. And I would say, well, what did you think was happening there? And they would say, we didn't know. And I would say, and then they would say things like, sometimes we heard screams. And they had just tried to ignore it because they were so terrified for their own safety. But the idea that that this country, in a sense, was filled with torture centers, filled with execution spots, At the biggest cemetery right outside of town, next to the international airport, there's a graveyard, a cemetery. But next to it, there's these huge bulldozed troughs with mass graves. Openly, they were killing and burying people, tens of thousands of them in plain sight. That was shocking. So, of course, it had echoes of many other horrific tyrannies we've heard about in the past. You saw the rooms full of files, and I looked at some of them. I even saw one of the autopsies. There was a routine coroner's report when they'd killed somebody from torture, and they would just say the heart stopped beating. But, of course, the heart had stopped beating under torture from them. And these also were people who lived in residential neighborhoods, had families, and came and lived and worked and tortured and kept files and then went home again year after year after year. And you think, how debased can a society be? You leave the torture chamber, which is the most horrific thing on earth, and you go out and the first thing you see is a little tailor shop just outside the residential neighborhood, maybe 50 meters away. Next to it, there's a cafe. Around the corner, there's a dog groomer. Across the street, there's a gym. Then there's restaurants, and, life goes on. But meanwhile, here, it's like something out of a horror, like the Blair Witch Project. And you think, how can a society stoop to this level? So sadly, what I discovered that in Syria is something I've seen in all tyrannies, and that is that after a certain period of time, people adapt to their oppressor. Essentially, they lie down with their torturer. Not everybody, but most people do out of fear. Some become passive accomplices. Some become victims. And some become active accomplices. And that is the terrible thing about human nature and the thing about coercive political systems is that, by and large, people, if given the opportunity to live freely or not be tortured and then become an oppressor themselves, they will choose the latter option. So seeing this was deeply disturbing and reminded me of these sort of truths of human nature. And I found it, it's very sad to see that. More than anything else, more than even being angry, I've seen this before. So it's not as if I was new to this. I've seen cruelty exercised, but to think that it had been exercised over such a long period of time and that the society had simply acquiesced, and so had the international community, that, I came away feeling mostly sad and disturbed, worried. Also, I have an open question mark about the future of Syria, because quite apart from what the Islamist rebels who've taken over and how, what they do, it's the trauma in the society. How are they going to deal with it? That nobody's really talking about that.
You've seen it all, and you've seen these changes, and it's very common at first when, place is liberated, the dictatorship falls, that there is this cheerful mood, joy, but also quite early, a lot of journalists and writers start to say what would happen with a new regime, in particular in case of Syria, people started to say but they are Islamist, so who are these guys who came to power? But I read also one of the pieces where it was said but what worse could be? I also thought about that more than, yes, there could be something like ISIS, there are horrors, but the horrible thing with this regime was the system, the state, institutionalized violence, where it's not a group, it's not a gang, it's not like the rebels taking the town, but the country built within years and years to really enforce that. But you mentioned something else, this living of this, because that's probably is indeed a story which is missed. So what do you think is a way? And my obvious question as a Ukrainian is how it seemed that the Russia is just left. What was also the Moscow's role on enabling all this? And they just gone.
I think unless the point is made by some kind of group of people, national Syrians, maybe victims, relatives of victims, civic-minded, and together with some international organizations and individuals, unless a kind of group comes together, a community that is determined to help Syrians confront and somehow exercise and deal with confront their demons, I don't see a very healthy society emerging. The natural instinct for most people when emerging from a horror is to not look back. So you want to go forward in life. And unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. So you live with some trauma, but so does your society, right? And it's this kind of see no evil, blind, moving forward problem that I think a lot of the world now has, and some countries more than others. Anyway, so I see that as a problem going forward, quite apart from the issues they may face in terms of like determining whether their country is an Islamist dictatorship or a more civic-minded quasi-democracy. I think that's on the line. And if I had to call it or guess right now, I would say it's more likely to be the former than the latter. And then there's the question of Russia. I found this fascinating because all of us know that Russia helped Assad crush the resistance, bombed, is responsible for killing at least tens of thousands, maybe more, Syrians in helping Assad suppress the uprising, right, against him. And when I arrived in Damascus, one of the first things I asked the guy driving me around was, where's the Russian embassy? And he showed me. It was a building maybe 10 stories high, right in the heart of town. I said, well, nobody's looted it? Or it's not been attacked? Is it closed? What's the deal? He said, I don't know. There might still be people there. And nobody had touched it. But the Iranian embassy had been looted. And next day, a friend of mine was driving outside of Damascus to the north, and she saw 150 army vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, Russian, leaving the area, moving from one base towards the coast where the Russians have a naval base and an air base nearby. And they broke down. They had a flat tire, so it took them about 2 hours to get the flat tire. And she tried to speak to them in Russian. They ignored her. They told her that she shouldn't come closer. They didn't shoot at her. But meanwhile, for 2 hours, Syrians were going by on the road, including the new rebel leaders, and nobody fired shots at them. So then that made me begin to ask, so what's the deal here? And then, of course, one was listening to what Putin was saying. And Putin was saying ambiguous things like, oh, yes, we'll wait and see. Maybe, we would like to be able to keep our bases, but we'll have to see what happens with the new regime. Very kind of offhand. And then one began to hear that, he hadn't yet met with Assad, which also suggested that he had sort of washed his hands of him. And over the past month, things have come out like, not only did he not see him right away, he left him dangling for at least a week. And in his remarks, it's as if he's dispensed with Syria. And it's also clear from the new leader of the rebel faction, Jolani, al-Shara is his real name, who spoke to an Arab channel and said, Russia is an important strategic partner of Syria. And I thought to myself, okay, what's going on here? And then I talked to somebody the other day who's, how shall I put this, very plugged in. And that person said to me that they thought that perhaps the Syrian rebels were hedging their bets against the arrival of Trump. And so just in case, because of his pro-Israel stance, that maybe they need a card up their sleeve to deal with the Americans. And that card could be, well, maybe we'll let Putin keep his bases, but you keep back, or make sure the Israelis pull back from the land they've taken, moving on from the Golan Heights kind of thing. Who knows? But they want leverage.
Jon Lee, there is a bunch of the questions I have, and I had like all the list on the Latin America, but probably I'll start with a longer introduction and would like to ask you to paint the picture for kind of not average Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians who are interested. So first of all, I would repeat the story that your interview with the President Boric, was a bit like the inspiration for our team, for me personally. Try to encourage and involve more Latin American, central left and Latin Americans to come to Ukraine and do this project we did with Connecting Continents, mainly because the president of Chile, Boric, whom you know well and whose profile you did in 2022, more or less said that he wants to be this kind of new left, like more against authoritarianship rather than Fidelista, more Allende type of person. At the same time, we understand that there are still left. There is Lula, and you also yourself wrote this article, which is called Lula, Maduro, and the New Cold War in Latin America. It's all for us related because for Ukraine to deal with Latin America is always to speak about the past, about the Cold War, the relations of those countries with first Soviet Union, but also their relation with, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. I would understand there are the countries where Nicaragua and Cuba, who are kind of clearly authoritarian, and also they are pro-Russian, and Venezuela. There are the leaders like Lula, who is a bit in the past, but it's still a huge democracy, continental country, I should say. There are the countries like Chile, where you have this president who has also, I would also say, a bit of the hostage of his history. He also, cannot openly just kind of speak on Ukraine because there are all the anti-American sentiments in the country. Now, there are also kind of people like Milei, who is not very much loved in the rest of Latin America by some people, also by kind of centrists, because he's just this weird libertarian. But he has unexpectedly okay relations with Ukrainian president, which is quite rare for kind of more right people to be on that side internationally. So it's complicated. I try to explain it in a very simple way, as I believe my compatriots, would kind of get it. But where it is it really this kind of Cold War still there? Is it really the real change? Does it this left-right matters that much today? Or it's something about else? And, after Lula, it won't be there any longer.
I think there's something of the return of the Cold War because of the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And now Xi and being bellicose and building up his military, China, So there is, and both countries, as Russia having a foothold in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, to a lesser degree elsewhere with the left-wing regimes, but nonetheless, yes, having forged good relations in the past with various regimes on the left in Latin America, and China being a new expanding economic presence in the region as well. At a time of depending on the regime in Washington, you've had back and forth. You've either had close focus, sometimes quite tendentious over immigration or drugs, or negligent inattention at other times. So there's a kind of residual resentment in Latin America towards the United States because it is the default success story in the hemisphere. Many of the other smaller countries in the region, particularly Central America and the Caribbean, have failed economically, and they require access to the U.S. for employment for their workers, their people, and therefore live off remittances. And that's true whether they're right-wing regimes or left-wing regimes. It's the safety valve for the region. It's a complicated story because also it's the drug consumer market, and drugs are created and then sent up through these other countries to the U.S. And the guns that kill people in Latin America come from the United States. So you have a kind of toxic matrimony that's now with periodic separations, but no divorce possible, right? That's the bottom line here. When it comes to the years now where Russia has invaded Ukraine and Putin has presented himself as this, he's managed to extend this idea that somehow Russia is still the Soviet Union amongst the authoritarian left-wing regimes. Now, why is that? It seems inexplicable because, of course, he's KGB, was not a communist or claims not to want to be and so on. But what happened even after the implosion of the Soviet Union was that an aspect of the security state in Russia never went away. And so you had the former KGB in some cases and the people involved with the Russian arms industry that was also tied in with the former intelligence establishment, whether it's Viktor Putin and any number of other characters, some of the new oligarchs, is essentially privatized what had been the Russian Soviet security state, but retained the relations with the people that they had been in league with before. So to my knowledge, that means that in Cuba, for instance, it was Communist Party before and Communist Party now. There are old Cubans in the security establishment who have not had relations with the Russian military-industrial complex and intelligence directorate. Now, who those people are, I'm not an expert. I don't know. But that's the way that in essence, yes, there was the drunken bear Yeltsin years, but meanwhile, there was a kind of Russian deep state, a Soviet deep state that remained. We saw Putin rise after only 10 years. We can see now that there are people who hark back to the Soviet years, who still espouse these, if not socialism, definitely authoritarian structures that allowed the Soviet Union and now allow Russia to cultivate its relations abroad, to sell weapons, to curry favors, to have an international espionage network. So that's remained. So where has it remained the most? Well, somewhat in Brazil, clearly in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, openly so. Obviously, there's African countries as well. And in Chile, going back to Chile, since you talked about Boric, here you have essentially a social democrat. He's in his 30s, but he's in coalition with the Communist Party. Now, the Chilean Communist Party is about as right-wing as you can get. What I mean by that is they regard Putin's Russia as the Soviet Union. And therefore, they've never relinquished their loyalties to Russia, Mother Russia. More recently, for instance, when Assad fled to Russia, they denounced the coup against Assad by the imperialist forces. They regard the rebels as backed as imperialist pawns of the United States and Israel. That's how torturous this gets.
How Boric is dealing with that in that position?
Boric deals with it extraordinarily well. Somehow he's managed to maintain a coalition government with people. That's an essential part of the Chilean Communist Party, and in a sense, they're crazy fringe, right? But he actually there's a kind of range of communists in the party, and some of the more pragmatic ones are in his government. Whatever he does privately, he's managed to do. So they will denounce him, they attack him, but they're not the key ones. I think actually the Secretary General of the Communist Party is a real enemy of his, but doesn't have the power to really alter things. And so for the time being, they haven't broken with him either, because they have a couple of people in the government. So on the one hand, he's had to juggle that, and also to deal with a kind of, as elsewhere, an increasingly conservative electorate and conservative politicians that try to undercut him at every step. But he is fundamentally a social democrat. Now, Lula is a slightly different story, and we can talk about Lula. But what I was just going to say, and there's another element to this, which I don't think is very often in the public analysis of the kind of global South problem on Russia and Ukraine. And that is that early on in the conflict, the Americans essentially on Ukraine's behalf began going to a number of their neighbors to the south and asking them if they would give or sell or weapons for Ukraine. And I think this was counterproductive for the most part. Why? Because I think all of these nations are always looking for leverage vis-a-vis the Yankees. And so they didn't like this. They didn't like being asked or assumed that they would just naturally give some of their old Soviet weaponry, planes, cannons, whatever it was, ammo, to Ukraine just because the gringos asked for it. And I heard this myself directly from a number of, let's say, leaders in Latin America, not only on the left, at least one on the right. So I thought that was interesting, and there was definitely a pattern of behavior. Apparently the Americans went around. So for some of them, it was like, oh, the Americans want something from me. What can I get in return? They could care less about Ukraine, perhaps, or maybe otherwise would have been happy to sell or exchange. I'll give them that, but you give me this. And then the Americans didn't do it. So I think there was a bit of a fumble by the Americans. I don't know who they delegated to this task, but I don't think they did it in a very sophisticated way. And then when Zelenskyy himself came to Latin America, I gather, or met some of these leaders in international conferences, he himself asked them directly, can we have some of your whatever? And I think that one in particular who spoke to me suggested that there was a kind of assumption that they would just naturally, they weren't seduced. They weren't courted enough. That was the feeling I got. And because you're also talking about a time in which the emergent leader of Latin America is Lula, who's playing with this idea of rebuilding the BRICS and all this other stuff, and is definitely holding Washington at bay and pretending that he can do something with Putin, and kind of is parroting the Putin line on the Ukraine invasion. I think they were kind of looking to him for leadership on this. And they were able to tread water. So bottom line, I think that the U.S. did not handle on behalf of Ukraine. They didn't handle this overture to Latin America particularly well. There was a misreading of signals and of the weather of the moment, the subtleties of the weather of the moment. I'm talking about the political weather. And the political weather until last, say, July, when Maduro stole the election in Venezuela and caused a distance between himself and Lula for the first time, was an ambiguous, complicated global South scenario in Latin America, where the authoritarian left, okay, they were already in Putin's camp. You can't do anything with them. But the rest were looking to Lula for leadership. And Lula was making noises that, NATO had pushed too far and blah, 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 and Putin, I had my conversations with Lula about this too. But what Lula needed was to be sweet-talked. Is still the leader in Latin America. Everybody's eyes are on Milei right now because he's the new darling of the right. Okay, but Lula, Brazil's a continent-sized country, and he wants Brazil to be at the big boys table. He repeated once and again in my conversations with him that Brazil, and along with a couple of other countries, needed to have a place at the UN Security Council. To be honest, thinking and speaking geostrategically, I think he's absolutely right. Why? Because the UN doesn't work anymore, right? Now, how do you do that? I don't know how you go about doing that. He'd become a bit like Don Quixote on that, like, we need a place at the big boys table. So what he was asking for here was someone to back him up. It could be the West. It could be the East. And he's gone with the East because I think he wasn't given the backing that he wanted for a place at the big boys table in the international conclaves. Now, Russia and China were ready to do it in the BRICS. It was already kind of there. What were the Americans offering to compete with that? Were they? I'm uncertain what they were. Sadly, I think in the Trump years, there was nothing. They sent some, frankly, cowboy character who literally wore a Texan cowboy hat and cowboy boots in his years in Brasilia under Trump. Literally. Like some kind of cartoon character who loved Bolsonaro. And then during the Biden years, frankly, it was very mediocre policymaking in Latin America because they were concerned about how it would play out electorally, domestically in the United States. And so they didn't do anything on Cuba. They did very little on anything. And they were just kind of treaded water with Brazil. They went down and gave him like football T-shirts and did selfies with him. But, this is a big country. Lula has a lot of pride. He believes himself to be the leader of a nation that deserves mature treatment. And I don't think he was getting it. Bottom line, I couldn't go to a judge and swear that this is 100% the truth. But reading between what I've been told, what I've heard, what in my conversations with the various leaders and others, this is kind of what I think happened. I think the U.S. and its allies did not have an applied project to win over the global South in an applied and systematic way. One size does not fit all. You can't treat Brazil the same way you treat South Africa, the way you treat Nicaragua, the way you treat Pakistan. You need to have teams of people with an applied policy that evolves over time. And I just don't think we had that. Just as we didn't have an applied policy when it came to arming Ukraine, right? It was made, as we all saw, it was kind of like policy making almost in public. You'd have Biden or saying one thing and then Zelenskyy asking for a certain weapon system, and then Biden would say no, and then 3 months later he would give it to him. Unfortunately, it was reactive. And if you're playing a chess game, you don't want to show your thinking to your adversary. And I think the West was constantly one step behind on the chessboard here. And I think it could have been handled better. So there was no concerted campaign to alter the thinking in Latin America, the residual thinking, to re-educate the kind of intelligentsia on what Russia is today, as opposed to what it was back in the 1980s.
You mentioned yourself also that the United States didn't kind of reckon with their past. They never really acknowledged what they did wrong. And it's also the part of the story, you know, compared to a lot of other empires. They just like kind of pretended it never happened, like, or at least like apologized for quite a few things. So we do still have this paradigm of my enemy, you know, is my friend. And that's very unfortunate, but I still would maybe try to explain a bit more in a nuanced way, not in that kind of in details, but would I imagine the Ukrainians who kind of know all these horrible things about the Soviet Union, and they really don't understand often the Soviet sentiment in Latin America. In this regard, you know, there are dictators, there are regimes, as we said, like Cuba or Venezuela. But, you know, Lula was a fighter against dictatorship. He was pro-democratic fighter. So the sad part, which feels kind of sad, that, you know, you have this kind of more democratic leaders who are siding with evil Russia in this regard. You explain it well, but has Lula changed? Or he's this kind of still pro-democracy, or just like Russia is just a player who helps them to be seen in the global stage? What is this sentiment? I also talked to quite a few, you know, Argentinian and other journalists, and they usually say, you know, it's very hard to, in Latin America, to criticize like Cuba because of Castro. There are particular, you know, people like Castro, like Che Guevara, like the others. You just don't do that because also, you know, like you don't rethink that. And it's a problem for some of the Venezuelan protesters that some of the left or, you know, is not in solidarity with them. I know that like some people also complain that, you know, like the left in Latin America do not support like the positive cause, the cause of the human rights in some of the countries where they are, you know, like where somehow kind of there is also these double standards on the human rights issues.
I mean, I in a way, I'm repeating myself, but I think that there has not been a concerted, since the end of the Cold War, the United States and the West did not invest in strategic communications, call it strategic communications, call it good PR, a campaign to re-educate the people that had been on the other side as passive recipients or somehow sympathizers with the USSR and the idea of the left in the Cold War. Maybe in Latin America, it includes a lot of people who were victims of the right-wing dictatorships that the Americans supported. Once the Americans, quote unquote, won the Cold War, they just assumed everybody would get on board. You know, now we won, you lost. Everybody wants to be rich like the Americans. You know, we'll give you trade deals. You should all be happy. You can drive a Jeep. You can have a color television. You can, you know, whatever. No, it's not good enough, is it? We know that now. And so you have a residual left in a lot of these countries that have felt left out, that whatever happened in the USSR, they did not give up their feelings of estrangement from the Colossus of the North or the West. They felt disenfranchised from the American dream that was being exported to their countries. And during the 40 years of democracy or democratization since the 1980s, they have watched as, for the most part, democratic Latin American regimes have been exceedingly corrupt. And they've seen the enrichment of the political class and a kind of musical chairs of various parties. And in some cases, including the former left, they feel disenfranchised from that. And so they remain vulnerable and receptive to the clarion call of a black and white world of authoritarianism, in which you still have those people, as we know, whether it's Putin or Orban or whoever it is, coming up with language about anti-colonialism or Nazism and this kind of stuff. They tend to believe what they have been told by their former allies. So we're talking about a fairly small core of people. but they have worked at their messaging. In the rebuilding of empire that Putin has been involved in over the past, say, 20 years or 15 years, he has not been countered by an equivalent campaign by the West. They simply derided him. Remember when Obama openly called Putin a junior varsity character? That was a big mistake. Every time you show open contempt in public, this is a problem. He's got short man syndrome. He has to get back, and he has. And the U.S. has rested on its laurels and has not done enough, and certainly has not done enough. It didn't move into action quick enough. It's not enough to go to a Peruvian and say, look, Russians are like the colonial powers that once ruled over you because they invaded Ukraine. Well, what does a Peruvian know about Ukraine or care about Ukraine? I'll tell you that most Latin Americans, if you bring up Ukraine to them in almost any circles, but okay, we're talking political and media circles, because the people on the street, they don't know. They will say, yeah, very corrupt country, isn't it? That's the first thing they will say. And aren't they kind of all together? They don't really understand the division. So whether it was Ukraine's sin of omission in not also asserting its sovereignty with a whole spectrum of positive, assertive embassies around the world, kind of left it to Russia to own that space. Since the invasion, I know there's been some catch up, but again, they didn't have a concerted campaign to win over the global South. It was sort of delegated to various allies who spoke on their behalf, and the occasional journalist like yourself or others who can go and show their faces in these places. There hasn't been enough.
3 years off. Some things we know. So we know already how to talk. We know about the Soviet sentiment, the other things, the anti-American sentiment, all kind of things. Where do you think things where we could be understood as Ukrainians?
It remains an abstraction. Look, Latin America has always been a continent on the periphery. They even experienced World War II as a thing that happened over there. Yes, of course, we all know that Nazis went there and Jews went there, but basically it's the New World and the Old World. They're cut off in a very profound way psychologically from the reality of the Middle East and Asia and Europe. It's this abstraction. How do you make it less abstract? It's always been my argument that for Ukraine, for Ukrainians, the important thing is to be in their face. You need to bring Ukraine to Mexico City, to Lima, to Brasilia, to Buenos Aires. How? That's up to the Ukrainians. But showing them videos of guys with beards in military clothes operating drone systems or being bombed isn't a way to win them over. They're thinking, oh, military guys, soldiers, are they Russian or are they Ukrainian? They don't really know initially. And who are these people, people who look very impassive when they're bombed? I've always said that the fact that the Ukrainians are impassive and quite courageous, don't like to show their emotion in public, doesn't help them. Because what they tend to see on television is these impassive people who are not showing emotion, despite the fact that they're being bludgeoned from the air day after day. So how do you get across to a Latin American that these are people they should care about? They need to know them. They need to know them not as soldiers, but as ordinary people. Now, whether that means cultural groups coming and putting on plays and giving speeches and doing fashion shows and reciting poetry and playing music, maybe. Kind of like revive Lorca's idea of the traveling cultural circus in the Spanish hinterland in the run-up to the war. Something like that. El Gran Barroco, where people see you. And they don't just see you in the capital, but they see you in the provinces. And they begin to understand that there is that you have your own narrative. You can't expect them nowadays in 2025 to go and read whatever you've written about, Russian colonialism in, some smart site. Not everybody's going to read that. You have to get out there and get it and mix it up. It has to be a concerted program, a cultural outreach. And nobody does it very well anymore, I have to say. But I have to say, I think I don't know quite how they've done it, but the Russians have done it well. I'll tell you a little story and you can extrapolate from it what you want. A few years ago, an American former diplomat told me that after the fall of the Soviet Union, he and a group of others in the embassy were summoned and were told that in this particular Latin American country, there was a list of, let's say, 38 Soviet deep sleeper agents that this agency within the embassy knew about. It gave them their names, their fake names, their real names, and their addresses. And it said it wanted them to visit them to find out their intentions. Extraordinary. So it's like something out of a spy novel. So over the next couple of months or whatever it was, these guys went to these, knocked on these doors. And in some cases, these were people born in, Sevastopol or Leningrad. In other cases, they were, from the country, but had sworn loyalty decades before to the Kremlin. But they were all sleeper agents waiting to be activated 30, 40 years later. And now they were old people. And so they would knock at the door and they would say, and the door would open and there would be a 78-year-old man or woman. And they would say, Ludmila Aletieva, when her supposed name was, Juana Arias or whatever. And they would have a conversation. And the idea was, are you still loyal to the Kremlin? What are your intentions? Can we rest easy because of you now? I don't know what they did because I wasn't really told what the follow-up was. But the point is, the Russians had that kind of program, right? Did the Americans have anything similar? I don't think so. They just expected everybody to, want to embrace the American dream and come over. This idea of, you too can have a Cadillac. You too can have a color TV. So, and of course, as we've seen, they all got those things, but in some cases, their minds are still authoritarian. Even now, we see the Russians all over the place. A lot of them have Brazilian passports. The ones they find with binoculars near Norwegian military airfields are Brazilians. But really, they're Russians with Brazilian passports. How they got those passports, I don't know. There's thousands of them Russians flying to Argentina to give birth there. We've seen the various honeypot entrapment schemes in the past by the Russians that seem to be quite effective. We now see the right wing of the Republican Party sympathetic to Russia and its aims. They've bought, it's not just Lula, it's right-wing Republicans in the United States who think that NATO moved too fast and what's Ukraine anyway, and let's appease Putin, right? It's a problem of perception and determination. I think the Russians have been working hard to create a certain perception for years. And lo and behold, they've been successful. They know to a degree, they've been successful in riling up anti-colonial sentiment all these years later in French West African countries and getting the French kicked out and getting their own people in, their mercenaries. We've seen this again and again over the past 2 years. So clearly what they're doing is more successful than what, quote unquote, we're doing in the sense of winning hearts and minds in the global South.
When you say we, you're really speaking, a lot about the West as such. I should also, change a bit this kind of, not a negative tone, but it's very reasonable what you say. I'm just also saying when I had a chance to interact with people, I also see that compared to how we've seen it from here, when we see RT or how the Russia claim how they own the continent, you also kind of understand that it's not really that pro-Russian in a way. I always sometimes say, the money RT invest into their operation, it's millions of dollars. Once I counted, I used to run the English-speaking Ukrainian channel. It was after 2014, we did a project for experts. And I said, if I count money and our budget per year, which, I was in charge of fundraising, and if I know the RT money, we couldn't exist for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So also we do a lot with very limited resources. Had also recently had a chance to talk to the former Ukrainian Minister for Foreign Affairs. And he also said that, for us, especially after 2014, before 2022, actually also the Europeans didn't get the Russian war against Ukraine. And like these limited resources were used to persuade some people in Netherlands, in Switzerland, in Finland, in Spain, in Portugal, just to kind of put some level of sanctions to Russia after what they started. So I also think it's a bit too late, but also saying that the rest of the world mainly, woken up after 2022. It was extremely hard for us to also explain what was going on before. I'll use the chance to say, what have you seen in Ukraine? How many times you've been after the full-scale invasion, and like what was interesting for you?
Twice. I mean, if things had worked out differently, I would like to have gone there more. I still would like to go back. I mentioned it a minute ago, the kind of the impassive quality. Maybe this is Slavic, but it's on the one hand, it's very admirable. Though I think the Ukrainians are their indomitability, their determination to carry on with normal life, even though they're under siege, is, I think, very moving and immediately admirable to people who come from the outside. And so I think that alone helped Ukraine's cause hugely in the wake of the full-scale invasion. So that swung the needle hugely in the Ukrainians' favor. What was the one thing that most impressed the world, including myself, about Ukraine since the full-scale invasion? Their courage. And I'm not just saying that because you're here, but it's true. They showed that old-fashioned quality that all of us have admired since time immemorial, that not everybody shows, not every leader shows. Zelensky's may have his flaws, I don't know, but the fact that he remained there, that he, showed his face, and yes, he was an actor before, it doesn't matter. You're either a heroic figure inside or you're not. Sadly, Abdul Ghani of Afghanistan, who was America's guy in Kabul, was not a courageous man. He allowed his fears to overtake him. He fled, and the Taliban walked into Kabul. Actually, just 6 months later, we saw the opposite happen in Kyiv. And I think this was the biggest ingredient in causing the world to embrace the Ukrainian cause, including many people who'd not been focused on it before. This idea of a country that was under onslaught, that was, willing to stand up to a much greater power. And then the horrors that were revealed after Bucha, I think there was huge waves of sympathy. And I think we saw a new dynamic set in. Now, preserving that same degree of solidarity and identification with a cause has not been easy. It's been made diffuse over the last 3 years because it's become largely a military story. You have the caprice of the news media in covering it or not. You have the story of Zelenskyy going and asking for help. Initially, everything he said was followed, and then eventually he became maybe overly familiar. But it coincides with Putin's ability to change the narrative again. And so I think we've seen a reascendant Putin. We've seen him manage to undermine some of the messaging and some of the solidarity that was felt towards Ukraine by probably merely because he's good at the messaging, the fact that they've survived economically, and probably the way they've allocated resources to buy people, organizations, and even countries off. Going back to myself, I would just say that. I would just say this kind of stoicism of the Ukrainians, the degree to which it's obvious that they do feel they have a distinct culture and have seized the occasion of the siege of the war to go deeper in exploring and trying to identify and exhibiting their particular cultural and national traits. All of these things are impressive. Many people have been won over by the Ukrainian predicament. Russia has certainly not won many friends. I think a lot of people if they had illusions about Russia before, whatever they say publicly, they're mostly gone. They know what Russia really is. You can't really dress that up. The world is a different place than it was 3 years ago. Is it resolved? No. Do I think Ukraine could still do more to swing people's hearts and minds to its cause? Yes. What do I think that is? I'm not sure. I gave you one scenario.
It's a lot of things. There is no one way to do it. But I think we're using this as a chance because not just because of the war. For us, it's also the way to learn about the world. Because, in the countries which are preoccupied with all troubles, it's very hard to see the bigger world. You overburden. But this moment in particularly taught Ukrainian society that it matters. So I also think that there is an openness of Ukrainians to go to tell, to understand why somebody's going and telling, to accept the people. So I also think it's a part of the kind of very tectonic shift, not just because of the war, but the Ukrainians' dependency on the world. It's not a good thing when you depend on the world, but I think on the human level, there is more interest, there is more openness and eagerness and beyond of the state policies. I still want to ask you about your recent profile. You wrote one before you went to Syria. There was this long but incredible writing of you about the President Milei, who is kind of a weirdo. We have this strange situation when they found a way to speak to Zelenskyy, which is very unusual that he's so openly pro-Ukrainian, which is better for Ukraine. But of course, there is always the risk because there are a lot of people in Argentina, in Latin America, who kind of talk by him. What is your major summary after meeting him?
I would definitely say he's personally quite strange. But of course, he's the darling of Davos and, the IMF and all the rest of it because he's bringing down inflation. So it doesn't matter that the rumors are that he sleeps with his dogs and his sister, It's amazing what people will overlook in favor of economic progress. It's extraordinary. Anyway. The fact of the matter is that I was there also during the inauguration. I saw Zelenskyy arrive and this big hug that Milei gave him on the stage there in front of the public the day he became president. And I was thinking to myself, what's Zelenskyy doing here? Why is he embracing this guy? And all I could assume was that he was looking for friends wherever he could find them. And of course, just the year before, the previous Argentine president had visited Moscow, and I think 3 weeks before the invasion had told Putin in full view of the public that Argentina could be his gateway to the Americas. So Zelenskyy was seizing the opportunity to make one new friend in the world. And of course, Argentina is not an insignificant country. It's a country with big, vast resources. It's one of the larger economies in the world, maybe second tier, but nonetheless, it had previously had an important relationship with Russia. So why not turn that around? I get it. I spoke with Milei about Ukraine and Zelenskyy, and he immediately he's like, he's my friend, he's wonderful. I love him. I sent him a menorah. He's converting to Judaism as well. Where that comes from, I'm not sure exactly. Why Zelenskyy? Is it a authentic thing?
No, he kind of communist and left are his enemies. So obviously he kind of has this opposite other thing beyond of something,
It also puts him closer to the U.S., generally speaking. Anyway, okay, so he's a friend of Ukraine. Personally, if that was my only friend in Latin America, I would try to find more. The problem you have, again, with many of the other former lefty, whether it was AMLO in Mexico or Lula in Brazil, is this idea that, okay, they want me to be Ukraine's friend, but what am I getting in return? I think this leverage issue was not applied well or in a sophisticated enough way by Ukraine's international friends.
I'll follow up on Milei more or less. So is Argentina doing well? Are his reforms working? How they are seen?
Yes, he's brought down inflation. It's still not down. It's still 25 to 40% a year, which is not great. So it's significantly down from what it was, 200% a year. It's still high. Depending on who you talk to, they think, it's all going to be a disaster. He's way too stringent on the Austrian school of economics, privatize everything, no government, no state. And then there are those who think, actually this could work. But who has he alienated? Well, everybody on the left, of course. He got rid of the women's ministry. He got rid of the human rights ministry. His vice president is somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. She believes that the dirty war never happened and that the real victims of the dirty war are the military family. And I think she wanted to turn the kind of equivalent of, Argentina's Auschwitz, ESMA, the naval school of the mechanics, where people were kept and then doped and thrown into the sea, into some kind of Disney World. So these are all aspects that scare people who are looking for a government that's linear, that is respectful, all the sectors of society. Milei has a very abrasive us versus them kind of discourse. But I think people on the right, business interests, and those who are fed up with the corruption of the kind of big state Peronista governments prior to Zelenskyy are hopeful and optimistic and hoping for the best. It's still only just over a year that he's been in office, so let's watch this space. If he brings down inflation, he could be very successful. Will he get big entrepreneurs or foreign powers or companies to invest in Argentina, which is what he hopes? So far, none have been coming. So let's see. I think he has a honeymoon that's unusual. And I think it's because so many Argentines were fed up with the hyperinflation they had, this kind of belligerently populist rhetoric from before, from the left. Now they're dealing with this strange guy on the right, but they see that the international community is sort of embracing him, so they're hopeful. But he's been quite cruel to certain sectors of the population, like pensioners didn't get their usual cost of living increase. And in a place where everything's costing more because of inflation, they're really suffering. He doesn't have the usual empathy that you would expect of a leader when you question him about this. I questioned him, and he spoke to me for several minutes about numbers, never people. He's a bit autistic, I think. In fact, he may be very autistic.
I'm obviously curious, a very honest question, you met so many of these world leaders. I wouldn't name kind of any other journalist beyond all these anchors of the programs, but I'm speaking about the decade. I'm speaking about, people like Chavez. You interviewed Pinochet. There were the bad guys and the good guys and the guys who were changed. It's like the student's question. Who was the most interesting person you met? Your stories, by the way, I want to encourage everybody to read them because they're about the people. They're about the humans. They are very nuanced. It's not about big powers. It's not just about these big guys or ladies. But who were the ones which impressions, stayed with you, not just because you wrote the article, but you just saw, that you met these people, who are the history for the world.
I can do some just thumbnail things very quickly. Who did I like the most? Well, one of them was Gabriel Garcia Marquez. What an amazing man. Very generous, very warm. I really liked him. He was an exception because he was the one figure who wasn't a person of political power himself. I really like Gabriel Boric, the young leader of Chile. I think he's a good human being and means well and would like to be a statesman. It's an unusual feature. I wouldn't say that about many other leaders I've met. The most evil leader I've ever met was Charles Taylor of Liberia, who's now doing 50 years in The Hague because he is the one who invaded Sierra Leone with those arm and leg chopping guerrillas for the sole purpose of getting the diamonds of Sierra Leone. Truly evil man, psychotic or psychopath. I did meet Pinochet, and it's funny, some people want to say, why didn't you name Pinochet? Well, he killed 3,000 people. But it wasn't so much that he was evil as he was the last fascist, true fascist. And I say this word carefully. There was Hitler, there was Mussolini, there was Franco, and there was Pinochet. He was the last one. And I was so aware of that when I sat in front of him. I'm looking at the last fascist. If this was the 1940s, he would have been one of the Axis powers. He is a Nazi in his mind. So I was fascinated by him because he was truly ideologically convinced of what he was doing. He believed everything he, was doing, that he was taking a brick out of the wall of the Soviet Empire. He was fighting this terrible scourge called communism. In a sense, because he had a belief, I was able to speak with him. I didn't agree with him, but I was able to speak with him in a way that I was appalled more privately with Charles Taylor because I was very aware that Charles Taylor had no ideology whatsoever. He knew what he was doing, and he was killing all these people, innocent people, for greed. It was different with Pinochet. I guess it's shades of evil, maybe. The King of Spain surprised me. I remember he He talked to me in slang. I never expected that from the king. And he tried to use me with his government to be able to go to Cuba. He wanted to go to Fidel Castro's Cuba, and the right wing, he needed permission from the then right wing prime minister of Spain, who had been trying to stop him from going. Anyway, it was funny. So we whispered in my ear and he used slang. And the last thing I expected was the king of Spain to be like this. It was the first royal I ever met. Oh, I could go on. There are many interesting people. I did meet Zelenskyy. I haven't written about him. I found him very impressive. Personally, I think he's an extraordinary character. I met Obama once. I spoke to him in the Oval Office. I was very aware that I was meeting with the President of the United States in the Oval Office. It was a pretty amazing moment. He's a very sophisticated guy who controls the moment. Chávez was difficult to dislike when you were with him. Very warm, very charismatic, magnetic. He would grab you. He would hug you. Lula's like that too. Lula's very physical. It's difficult not to be seduced in the moment by someone like Lula, because he's grabbing your knee, your shoulder. He says, "Oh, how old are you?" If you were in his office, he would interrupt you about 5 minutes in. He would say, "So, how old are you?" And you would say, "Oh, I'm 33 or whatever it is." And he would go, "I wish I was that age. Look at you, youth." And he would flatter you like this. This is what he does. At the moment he does that, he means it. And he will smile at you, and you feel that you're with like a really good-hearted uncle. And then you have to be tough and ask tough questions again. So Lula's his own character. He's one of these rare, truly charismatic individuals. There are many leaders who have no charisma. He has a lot. What I always find interesting is the ones who really understand the use of power. They're aware of their power. And that is a dynamic that is unique to people who possess it. And I'm always fascinated. That's one of the reasons I'm drawn to profiles of people who possess power, because I know that that is a thing. We dress it up in democracies about, it's not really power. It's like, they're the custodians of the people's will and blah, blah, blah. Well, okay. But there's also power. And I always, if I can, I ask them, if there's a moment in any of my meetings with leaders, I say, "So, what's it like?" And they say, "What?" I say, "Power." And they'll some, their eyes will glisten. Others, they go into denial, like, "What do you mean? Power, what's that?" But it's the ones whose eyes glisten. That's interesting. I'm sure if we did it to Trump, his eyes would glisten.